Welcome to Once Upon Yesterday, the podcast where we dust off the history books and breathe life back into the past. I'm your host, James, and today we're going to watch a kingdom fall and a republic rise. Picture this, a small city on the banks of the Tiber River, not yet the sprawling Rome of marble columns and crowded forums, no Colosseum, no Caesar, no empire stretching from Britain to Egypt, just a walled settlement of wooden houses, dirt streets, and maybe the occasional goat wandering into the market like it owns the place. In the year 509 BCE, people of the city decided that they were done with kings. Over it. They wanted something new. And what they created wasn't just a government. It was a system that would influence the political world for over 2,000 years. Today, we're talking about the rise of the Roman Republic, a story of rebellion, political invention, family feuds, and the occasional public tantrum. It's the tale of how Rome went from that little hill town over there to the kind of power that made other nations whisper, "Uh-oh, they're coming." So grab your toga and make sure it's draped over the correct shoulder. We have standards here. And let's head back to a time before Caesar, before the empire, back to the moment the Romans said, "No more kings." So let's set the stage. It's the late 6th century BCE. Rome isn't yet the sprawling marble city you're picturing from movies. No gladiators in the Colosseum. That hasn't even been built yet. No Caesar statues. He won't be born for another 500 years. Instead, you've got a collection of 7 hills dotted with wooden houses and mud brick buildings. The streets? Narrow, uneven dirt paths that turn into slushy messes after a rain. The smell of the air is a mix of wood smoke, baking bread, and whatever the tanner shop down the street has been working on that day. Trust me, you don't want to know. It's a city on the rise, but still small enough that if you stand on the Capitoline Hill, you can look out and see the farmland in every direction. Vineyards, olive groves, patches of wheat, and herds of goats that probably wander into the streets more often than anyone likes to admit. For over a century, this city has been ruled by kings, 7 in total, if you believe Roman tradition. Some of these kings were legendary city builders and lawgivers. Others, well, let's just say they're the kind of leaders where you'd sigh and say, "We need an election yesterday." The last one, Tarquinius Superbus, better known as Tarquin the Proud, was, how do I put it nicely? Imagine a boss who never takes your ideas seriously, hoards all the best parking spots, and also might execute you if you annoy him. That's Tarquin. He didn't come to power through charm and good leadership. No, he literally murdered his predecessor, Servius Tullius, in front of the Senate, threw the body into the street, and declared himself king, which, I'll admit, is one way to apply for the job. From the start, Tarquin ruled with an iron fist. He ignored the Senate's advice, replaced opponents with his own allies, and ran the city like a personal kingdom rather than a shared community. But the real breaking point wasn't just his arrogance. It was his son, Sextus Tarquinius. Sextus committed one of the most infamous crimes in Roman history, the assault of Lucretia, a noblewoman celebrated for her virtue and loyalty. The story goes that she summoned her father, her husband, and a family friend named Lucius Junius Brutus, told them what had happened, and then, grieving and ashamed, took her own life to protect her family's honor. Now, in Rome, honor was everything. And this was the spark that lit the fire. Brutus and his allies swore an oath over Lucretia's body that there would never be another king in Rome. They rallied the people. Picture a swelling crowd in the forum, shouting and clanging weapons against shields, and they drove Tarquin and his family out of the city. And just like that, after more than a century of monarchy, Rome was leaderless. No king, no royal court, no clear plan for what came next. You know that moment when you quit a terrible job in a blaze of glory, storm out with your box of belongings, and then realize you have no idea what you're going to do next week? That was Rome in 509 BC. It was a thrilling victory, but now they had to figure out how to build something entirely new. So here we are, 509 BCE. The king is gone. The Tarquin family is on the run, and Rome has officially joined the ranks of post-monarchy governments, which is great until the next morning, when everyone wakes up and realizes, who's in charge now? Picture the scene. The Senate, Rome's Council of Elders, gathered in the Forum. These are mostly wealthy, older patricians in their crisp white togas with the purple stripe, looking dignified but also deeply stressed because the city needs leadership yesterday. There's probably some awkward silence as they all look at each other like, well, anybody have an idea that isn't, let's bring back a king? The problem was simple but huge. For generations, all political authority in Rome had been tied to the king. Without him, there was no single leader to command the army, enforce the laws, or preside over religious festivals. Someone had to step up, or more accurately, someone's. That's when Romans came up with a solution that was both brilliant and a little paranoid. Instead of one leader, they'd have two, the consuls. These guys would be elected each year, serve together, and share power equally. And here's the clever part. Each consul could veto the other's decisions. That way, no single man could become too powerful. Think of it like having two captains of a sports team, only instead of competing for most valuable player, they're competing for who can avoid looking like a dictator. The consuls would handle almost everything a king once did: command the army, oversee the government, enforce the laws. But they do it in constant partnership, like two CEOs who have to sign off on every big decision. But the consuls weren't the only new players in this system. The Senate stayed on as an advisory body, offering experience and stability. Then there were the popular assemblies, gatherings of Roman citizens who could vote on certain laws and elect officials. Now, before we start thinking this was some kind of ancient democracy for all, let's remember, citizen meant something very narrow in Rome. Women? Not citizens. Slaves? Nope. Foreigners? Forget it. Even among Roman men, political weight depended on wealth. If you owned land and had money, your voice carried further in the assemblies. If you were poor, well, your vote was more like a polite suggestion. Still, for the ancient world, it was a big leap forward. Power was no longer concentrated in one person's hands. It was distributed among multiple offices, each with checks and balances. The new Roman Republic looked good on paper: two consuls, the Senate, assemblies, a balanced system, at least in theory. But there was one very large, very obvious problem. The people running the show were almost entirely patricians, the old aristocratic families who could trace their ancestry back to the mythical founding of Rome. Patricians had the money, the land, and the political connections. They served as priests, generals, and top officials. They were the ones with influence in the Senate. They were, well, basically the Roman version of the old boys club. The rest of the population, the plebeians, were the farmers, laborers, the craftsmen, shopkeepers, and small landowners. These were the people building roads, growing food, and filling the ranks of the army. Without them, Rome couldn't function. And yet, in the early Republic, plebeians had almost no political power. Sure, they could vote in certain assemblies, but the choices were usually limited to patrician candidates. If you ended up in court, chances were the judge was a patrician. If you fell into debt, you might find yourself in debt bondage, working off what you owed, sometimes under brutal conditions. The tension had been building for years. Finally, in 494 BCE, the plebeians had enough. They decided to do something bold, something no one had ever tried in Rome before. They staged a walkout. And I don't mean a one-day protest in the forum with a few clever slogans on wax tablets. No, they literally left the city. According to the story, the plebeians marched out of Rome and set up camp on a hill a few miles away. This was the famous First Secession of the Plebs. Imagine thousands of citizens packing up their belongings, slinging tools over their shoulders, and leaving the patricians behind in an almost empty city. It was like the entire working class of a modern city deciding to take an extended vacation at the same time. Shops? Closed. Farms? Unattended. And worst of all, for the patricians, the army was basically gone. Now remember, Rome was always surrounded by potential enemies. Losing most of your soldiers overnight? That's a little bit of a crisis. The patricians quickly realized they were in trouble. The Senate sent envoys to negotiate, probably looking very dignified while also silently panicking. The plebeians had 3 clear demands. 1. Protection from unjust treatment. 2. A political voice in government. And 3. Safeguards against laws that only benefited the rich. The result was one of the most important reforms in Roman history, the creation of the office of tribune of the plebs. Tribunes were elected by plebeians to represent plebeian interests. They had the power to veto decisions by other officials, including the consuls. If a tribune said no, that decision was dead in the water. And here's the kicker. Tribunes were sacrosanct. No one could harm them or interfere with their duties without facing severe punishment. In other words, mess with a tribune, and the whole plebeian class comes after you. Over the next 2 centuries, the plebeians pushed for, and won, more rights. The right to marry patricians, access to the highest offices in government, written laws so everyone knew the rules, looking at you 12 tables. This long struggle became known as the conflict of the orders, and while it didn't erase inequality, wealth still did determine a lot. It proved something crucial. In Rome, political change could happen through organized, collective action. And if you're wondering whether the patricians learned to love sharing power, let's just say the relationship was always a little tense. But Rome was stronger for it, because now the Republic didn't just belong to the aristocrats. It was, at least in part, the people's too. By the middle of the 5th century BCE, Rome had sorted out enough of its internal political drama to start looking outward. And outward, they saw opportunity. Not that they were thinking, let's go conquer Italy, at first. In the beginning, it was more about defense. Rome was surrounded by other Latin cities, Etruscan powers to the north, and a whole assortment of hill tribes to the south and east, who were more than happy to raid your fields if you looked the other way for too long. And because the ancient Mediterranean didn't exactly have mutually assured destruction treaties, the best defense was often offense. So Rome started fighting, and winning. Imagine you are a Roman citizen soldier in this period. You're not a professional. There's no full-time army yet. You're a farmer, a blacksmith, maybe a potter. In spring, you leave your fields, strap on your gear, helmet, shield, short sword, and march out with your neighbors. The road is dusty, the sun is hot, and the miles are long. You camp at night with the smell of wood smoke in your nose, your sandals kicked off, and your shield propped beside you like an oversized dinner plate. And you fight, not for pay, but for the Republic, because in Rome's eyes, every citizen owed military service. Here's where Rome was different from a lot of other ancient powers. They didn't just conquer and loot, then walk away. When they defeated a neighboring city, they then offered a deal. Join us, you can keep some self-government, your local leaders, and your customs, but you'll also send troops to fight in our wars and follow our foreign policy. Sometimes they even gave partial citizenship the right to trade and marry under Roman law, but not full voting rights. It wasn't perfect equality, but compared to outright destruction, it was a bargain that many cities did take. The result? Instead of a patchwork of resentful, conquered people, Rome built a web of alliances. If someone attacked Rome, it wasn't just Rome they were fighting. It was Rome plus a dozen or more allied cities ready to send men and supplies. It was a brilliant mix of military strength and diplomatic savvy. Of course, not everyone signed up willingly. The Samnites, a fierce mountain people in central southern Italy, fought Rome in 3 long wars over several decades. These weren't quick skirmishes. They were brutal campaigns in rough, mountainous terrain, the kind of places where a Roman formation was about as useful as a shopping cart in a snowstorm. The Samnites won some big victories, and at times it looked like Rome might be stopped. But the Romans learned, adapted, and eventually overwhelmed them. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome had absorbed the Samnites and brought much of central and southern Italy into its orbit. In the south, Rome faced Greek colonies, like Tarentum, that weren't thrilled about Rome's next project. They called for help from King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a distant cousin of Alexander the Great. Pyrrhus brought a massive army, complete with war elephants. Imagine seeing one of those for the first time, and you're a farmer from Latium. The Romans fought hard, but Pyrrhus won his early battles at a staggering cost. His casualties were so high that he reportedly said, "Another such victory, and I am undone." And just like that, we got the term Pyrrhic victory, a win so costly it feels like a loss. Eventually, Pyrrhus went home, and Rome moved in. By the end of the 3rd century BCE, Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula. They had woven together a patchwork of allies, colonies, and citizens into a system that could supply endless manpower for future wars. Rome was no longer just a city-state. It was the central hub of a growing power, and for the first time, other major Mediterranean players started taking notice. One of those players sat just across the sea in North Africa, a wealthy trading empire called Carthage. If you want to understand the Roman Republic, you have to understand one thing. For them, politics and warfare weren't just related. They were inseparable. This wasn't a world of career politicians in suits and ties who never set foot on a battlefield. In Rome, if you wanted to rise to the highest offices, you were expected to strap on armor, march out with the legions, and bring home a victory worth bragging about. Picture the rhythm of a Roman year in the Middle Republic. Winter was for politics. The Senate met in the Forum. Candidates made speeches in their spotless togas, shaking hands, or maybe forearms. This is Rome. And promising to protect the people, uphold the laws, and totally not lead you into another expensive war. Spring was for sharpening swords. The consuls for the year prepared to lead armies, organized supplies, recruited soldiers, and offered sacrifices to the gods for good fortune. Summer was for marching off to campaign. The legions tramped out of the city in tight formation, their polished shields flashing in the sun, dust kicking up from the roads. Autumn was for coming home, hopefully victorious, parading captured loot and prisoners through the streets in a triumphal procession. Then the cycle started all over again. Every consul knew that military success wasn't just about Rome's safety. It was about their career. A victory could mean honor, fame, maybe even a triumph through the city where you got to wear a laurel crown and ride in a chariot while the people cheered. It was political gold. The downside? This meant there was always a temptation to seek more wars, or bigger wars, because nothing made a reputation like conquering new territory. And while this system created some incredibly capable leaders, it also bred ambition, the kind of ambition that could turn dangerous if left unchecked. Rome's military strength wasn't just about leadership, it was about manpower. Every Roman citizen of fighting age was expected to serve when called. A legion wasn't made up of professional soldiers in the early Republic. It was made up of farmers, craftsmen, traders, all marching together under some banners. You'd fight in the summer, then go home to plant or harvest in the fall. That meant Rome's army could bounce back from defeats with surprising speed. Lose a battle, muster the citizens again next year, and you got another legion ready to go. But it also meant war was everyone's business. Victories brought wealth, land, and prestige to the Republic. Defeats meant your neighbor didn't come home, or you lost the farmhands who helped keep your crops alive. There was, however, a flaw in the system. When you tie political advancement to military success, you create a class of leaders whose real loyalty might start shifting from the Republic as a whole to their own personal power. If a general commanded the same soldiers year after year, won them land and loot, and shared their hardships, these men might start feeling more loyal to him rather than the Senate back home. That loyalty was a powerful political weapon, one that the early Republic kept a wary eye on. Because the last time Rome had a leader with both immense popularity and military power, his name was Tarquin the Proud, and we all remember how that ended. For now, the system held together. The Senate kept control, the consuls rotated out every year, and the people were generally on board. But you can already see the seeds being planted, seeds that in a century or two would grow into the kind of political rivalries that could tear the Republic apart. As Rome's ambitions pushed it beyond the Italian peninsula, those seeds would start to sprout, because there was a new rival on the horizon, and it wasn't a hill tribe or a neighboring city-state. It was a wealthy, powerful, sea-based empire, and its name was Carthage. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome had done the impossible. In just a couple of centuries, it had gone from a scrappy hill town to the dominant power on the Italian peninsula. Its armies had marched through Latin plains, Etruscan hills, Samnite mountains, and Greek coastal cities. Its alliances crisscross Italy like a spiderweb. You pull one thread, and half the peninsula would come running to Rome's aid. And from Rome's perspective, life was good. But the thing about becoming the big fish in a small pond is you eventually notice the ocean just beyond your shoreline. Look south from Italy across the shimmering blue Mediterranean, and you'd see a coast of North Africa. And there, 1,000 kilometers from Rome, was Carthage, a city that was everything Rome was not. Where Rome's power was built on farmland, legions, and citizen soldiers, Carthage's was built on ships, trade routes, and merchant wealth. Rome ruled the land, while Carthage ruled the sea. Carthage's harbor was an engineering marvel. 2 great basins, one for merchant ships and one for warships, each able to hold hundreds of vessels. Their merchant fleet stretched from Spain to Egypt, bringing in gold, silver, grain, spices, and luxury goods Rome could only dream of. If Rome was a rising land empire, Carthage was a maritime superpower. For a while, there was no reason for conflict. Rome had its hands full with Italy. Carthage focused on trade across the Mediterranean. The two even signed treaties, polite, you stay in your lane, we'll stay in ours agreements. But then, the lanes started to blur. The trouble started in Sicily, the large, fertile island just off Italy's southern tip. Sicily was the Mediterranean's breadbasket, producing grain that could feed entire armies, and it sat right between Rome's sphere and Carthage's. By the 260s BCE, Rome was looking across the narrow straits and thinking, that would make a nice addition to our map. Carthage was looking at the same island and thinking, absolutely not. And in a messy local dispute between Sicilian city-states, one side asking for Rome's help, the other calling in Carthage, and suddenly, two powers that had been polite neighbors were on a collision course. This wasn't just another border skirmish or tribal raid. This was the beginning of a clash between two systems. Rome, land-based, citizen-soldier armies built for grinding down enemies in long campaigns. Carthage, sea-based, wealthy, and reliant on skilled mercenaries and unrivaled naval power. Each had strengths the other lacked, and neither was willing to back down. In 264 BCE, Rome sent troops to Sicily. Carthage responded with ships. The First Punic War had begun, Punic being the Roman word for Phoenician, the ancestral culture of the Carthaginians. It would last over 20 years, with battles on both land and sea, and it would mark the moment Rome stepped onto the world stage as a true Mediterranean power. And here's the kicker. These wars wouldn't just test Rome's military, they'd test the very structure of the Republic. Victories would bring wealth and territory, but they'd also bring new challenges, new inequalities, new kinds of political ambition. Rome had built a system to share power, check ambition, and avoid kings. But as it expanded into an empire, that system would be strained, and eventually it would break. That, though, is another story. The rise of the Roman Republic is often told like a clean, triumphant story. The people overthrew a tyrant, created a new system of shared power, and built a foundation for centuries of success. And yes, that's true, but it's also a little too neat. Because what we've really seen today isn't just the birth of a government, it's the birth of a pattern. A pattern where ambition and service go hand in hand, where military glory can open the door to political power, where compromises between rich and poor hold the system together, but also keep it in constant tension. The early republic worked because the Romans believed in it. Patricians and plebeians alike saw it as their system. Flawed, but worth protecting. They were willing to fight for it, literally, in the case of citizen soldiers who marched out each spring. That belief would carry Rome through centuries of growth. But growth changes things. Every new conquest brought wealth, but also inequality. Every great victory brought glory, but also generals with armies more loyal to them than to the Senate. And those seeds planted here, in the Republic's rise, would someday grow into the very forces that would undo it. Next time on Once Upon Yesterday, we'll jump forward to the Republic's most turbulent century. Civil wars will rip through Rome, politicians will weaponize the mob, rival generals will turn their legions against each other. And in the middle of it all, one man will rise, Julius Caesar, brilliant, ambitious, and dangerous to the system that he claims to serve. We'll watch as the Republic, built to avoid kings, ends up crowning an emperor in all but name. Until then, I'm James, and this has been Once Upon Yesterday. If you enjoyed this trip through Rome's early days, make sure to follow the podcast, share it with a fellow history lover, and leave a comment or review. It helps keep the history dusted off and ready to share. Thanks for listening, and remember, history isn't just about what happened, it's about how we got there.